Monday, January 8th, 2024 started out just like any other day. The only notable thing was that it was my first day heading back to the office after my employer had shut down company operations for 3 weeks, as they did every year during the holidays. The seasonal depression was really starting to kick in now that all the fun was over, and we just had another 3 months of freezing rain to look forward to before summer. Winter used to be my favorite season as a kid, but due to climate change it's just become depressing. It hardly ever snows anymore here in the GTA, so everything is just cold, grey and damp all the time, today being no exception. Traffic on the 404 was actually moving at a decent pace for once this morning despite the weather. I was torn between being happy that I wasn't stuck in the typical morning gridlock and being slightly disappointed that I would actually make it to work on time. As I approached the 401 interchange where the 404 turns into the Don Valley Parkway, the rain began to come down a lot harder. The dump truck I'd been following began to slow down, as did the rest of the traffic around me. I could have sworn I heard thunder over the roar of the rain pelting my windshield. Thunderstorms in the winter time, I thought to myself. It didn't make sense, but then again it was also supposed to be 10 and snowing. This time of year, not 6 degrees and pouring down rain, so I guess anything is possible. I began pressing down on the brake pedal to slow my car to the speed of the truck in front of me, when suddenly my foot slammed into the floor. I immediately panicked, thinking I had lost my brakes, and I took my right hand off the steering wheel to reach for the emergency brake. When I'd first started driving, my dad had taught me a trick where you can hold down the button on the emergency brake so it doesn't lock, and you can feather it on and off to slow down if you ever lose your brakes. I was about halfway through executing this plan when I froze. I froze because I realized something. The hand I had taken off the steering wheel hadn't been holding the steering wheel at all, and neither was the other one. In fact, I wasn't even in my car. My brain finally caught up to my surroundings, and I realized I was sitting in a plastic classroom chair in the middle of what appeared to be a warehouse. I was sitting in the chair with my arms out as if I was a kid pretending to drive a car, except I was actually driving a car. Or at least I had been just mere seconds ago. Had I just blacked out on the entire drive to work? I did work at a logistics company, but this did not look like our warehouse. I slowly stood up and looked around the room. All I could see around me were wooden crates and plastic pelican cases that looked vaguely like military gear of some kind. The only other object of note was a big yellow forklift sitting near the end of the row of crates. I began to walk towards it, thinking maybe I could find the operator and figure out just what the hell was going on. An electric hum came from the forklift as I approached it. I don't know a lot about heavy machinery, but I assumed that meant it was running. "Hello," I shouted out into the vast expanse of the building. Only an echo returned. I peeked inside the cab of the forklift, and indeed it was on, judging by the position of the key and the gauges on the dash being lit up. This meant someone had to be nearby, because I'm sure it's got to be a massive OSHA violation to leave a forklift turned on unattended. I called out a few more times, but no reply came. Was everyone out for a smoke break or something? Surely a warehouse of this size would be crawling with workers. At least ours was back at the company I worked for. Figuring everyone was out for a smoke break, or at the very least, given the early morning, it was probably shift change. I decided to see if I could find an office of any kind to see if anyone could tell me where I was. I had briefly tried to consult Google Maps on my phone, but I couldn't get any signal, likely due to being inside a large steel building. I eventually spotted some windows high up on a wall on the other side of the warehouse and figured that must be the office. As I walked towards it, I passed another forklift that looked like it had just been abandoned in the middle of putting a pallet of electronic equipment up on a rack. Just like the other one, the electric hum and position of the key indicated that it had been left on. A little farther up the aisle, there was a golf cart with a little orange blinking light on top of it. It had crashed into one of the metal support columns holding up the roof of the warehouse, and front end was completely destroyed. It just sat there, light still blinking as I walked past it. What the hell was going on here? Was there some emergency I was unaware of? I was beginning to get the feeling the staff of this place had abandoned it in a hurry. Eventually I reached a set of metal stairs that led up to an enclosed mezzanine area that I thought had to be the office. I climbed the stairs and opened the door to find the room completely empty. It was indeed an office, but instead of the loud atmosphere I was used to at work, it was dead silent. I slowly walked through the rows of cubicles, taking note of the steam coming off a coffee cup on one of the desks. People had been here recently. The most telling sign of all, though, was that every single computer was logged in and open on some Excel sheets or software that I didn't recognize. I may not have known a lot about forklifts, but I did know a lot about office computers. They time out after 5 minutes or so automatically and go to sleep. When you wake them up again, you have to enter your password again. If these computers were logged in, it meant that their users couldn't have gone far or been gone for long. Figuring now that something must really be wrong, I quickly scanned the room and found a door with a glowing red exit sign above it. I didn't know how I'd gotten here, but the people who worked here had clearly left in a hurry, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out why. I ran through the office and tore open the exit door, revealing a long hallway. I ran down the hallway towards another exit sign and just kept repeating the process, through door after door, until suddenly I was blasted with cold air and snow as I found myself standing in what appeared to be a parking lot. It had clearly been snowing heavily, but the blizzard was starting to clear and the morning light was beginning to shine through the snow. Although the light was extremely dim and I couldn't actually see the sun in the sky yet. Where the hell was I? It hadn't snowed like this anywhere near Toronto or my home in Newmarket since, well, ever that I can remember. My awe of the snow was short-lived, however, as I heard the door click shut behind me. My heart sank as I realized it was locked, and it looked like it had a keycard reader to open it again. I was wearing a light winter jacket over my usual business suit, but it was not sufficient for the weather I now faced. I could hear an engine running from around the corner of the building, so I began trudging through to snow towards it. My fancy dress shoes and suit pants becoming instantly soaked as I made my way through knee-deep snow. My feet stung with the cold, but I didn't care. That engine sound meant someone had to be nearby, and they could help me. Maybe it was a fire truck or an ambulance, and they had come to deal with whatever disaster had befallen this frigid warehouse. Maybe I would find the office staff huddled around it. I should have known better. As I came around the corner of the building, I almost walked straight into a running snowblower. My efforts to stop myself caused me to fall backwards into the snow, and I began to scramble backwards to get out of the way of the machine. Once I'd gotten out of the way and gotten to my feet, I realized that it wasn't moving. My heart sank again as I stared at the large John Deere tractor sitting in front of me. Much like the forklifts and golf cart I had seen inside the machine was just sitting there idling as if it had been abandoned in the middle of whatever its task was. In this case, it looked like it was about halfway done clearing the parking lot. Great, I mumbled to myself. It seemed that everyone really was gone. At least if that thing had been running for a while, the cab was probably warmed up, and it could provide some shelter. I approached the tractor cautiously, as the large augers of the snowblower attachment were still spinning, and I did not want to encounter those again. Once I was safely alongside, however, I practically threw myself up the steps into the cab. The warmth of the heaters felt almost burning compared to the cold outside, but I didn't care. It was better than freezing to death. I leaned back in the operator's seat and just lay there for a few seconds, enjoying it. Then I noticed something peculiar. There were no footprints leading away from the machine. If the operator had abandoned it as recently as the rest of the complex had been abandoned, then there should have been signs of them running away. The snow was also letting up, and there was no way it had snowed enough in the 10 minutes or so I'd been in this strange place to fill in the footprints. Hell, there should have been footprints everywhere if a large-scale evacuation had taken place. Something strange was definitely going on here. For the first time since my arrival, however, I finally felt safe enough sitting in that tractor cab that I could survey my surroundings. The snow had now completely stopped, and I could see that I was sitting next to a massive white building at the bottom of what appeared to be a giant open-pit mining site. Rock walls rose up on all sides with a spiral roadway leading to the top. There was also a massive radio tower on top of the building that must have been at least 100 feet above the surface level. It appeared to be held up by cables running down to the rim of the giant pit. Seeing the tower, I foolishly tried my phone again, but there was still no signal. I stuffed it back in my pocket and continued to look around. From what I could tell, it looked like this was some kind of research facility that had been built into an old diamond mine. My suspicions were quickly confirmed as I noticed a row of white pickup trucks with the words Summer Island Research Facility written on the doors, and various departments such as security or maintenance written along the sides of the bed. Well, at least now I knew where I was, just not where this place was. As luck would have it, there was a much more substantial winter jacket stuffed behind the seat of the tractor, and inside one of the pockets was a key card. With this, maybe I could get back inside and formulate a plan to deal with my current situation. I put on the jacket and once again braved the cold and made my way back to the door I had come out of. The light on the door turned green as I tapped the key card up against it, and a loud clunk indicated it was now unlocked. I quickly stepped inside and furiously stomped my feet to try and get all the snow off my shoes and pants. I had a better coat now, but I needed to find some boots and snow pants if I was going to go outside again. My new mission was now to find an employee locker room or something where I could find some gear. I wandered up and down the halls, finding nothing but empty office after empty office. I was beginning to contemplate my situation more, and I wondered if I had in fact rear-ended that dump truck back on the 404 and died in a horrible car accident. And if this was some kind of purgatory, even though I had only been here an hour tops at this point, my morning commute, and even my life back in Newmarket seemed like a distant memory. Was all that even real? Or was this even real? I had no idea how I'd even gotten here, and the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Eventually, I stumbled into a lab of some kind. I guessed that this was where the research at the Summer Island facility took place. There was a lot of science equipment that I couldn't even begin to tell you what it was for scattered around the room, and several computer desks all covered in papers. A large whiteboard in the corner of the room caught my attention. It was covered in what I guessed were mathematical equations, but mixed in with the numbers were symbols I have never seen before. At the far end of the room was a large glass wall, and on the other side of it was a device that slightly resembled a jet engine with the cowlings removed. Must be testing something for a new fighter plane, I thought to myself. But as I drew closer, I realized this was not an aircraft engine. The front end, where the fan blades would be, and the rear, where the thrust would come out, were capped off completely, and what I initially thought were hoses turned out to be thick electrical cables. Every now and then sparks shot out of the machine, but otherwise it was completely silent. Had thing malfunctioned somehow, and that's why everyone left in such a hurry? I was fine, so what could be so dangerous? Then a terrible thought struck me. What if this was nuclear and the whole place was irradiated? I decided my best course of action at this point was to continue looking for the gear I needed, then get as far away from this place as possible. While I knew that tractor was still running outside, it was slow, and I had no idea how to drive a tractor. I needed to find the keys to one of those trucks and get up to the surface and figure out where I was. Luckily for me, the locker room was not far from the lab, and by some stroke of luck, there was a locker open. Judging by the same high-vis winter jacket I had found in the tractor that hung inside the locker, this must have belonged to one of the maintenance workers. I took the matching snow pants, boots and gloves out and quickly put them on. Rummaging around a little more, I managed to find a hat and some snow goggles as well. I probably looked like I was ready to climb Mount Everest, but I guess in a way that's exactly what I was about to do. I found a set of car keys on one of the tables and quickly snatched them up, looking them over and noticing the Ram truck's logo on the side of the key fob. At least it wouldn't take long to figure out which vehicle these were for. So far, I had only seen F-150s outside. I pulled my goggles down over my eyes as I ventured back out into the cold. It was a little brighter out now, but it still seemed way too dark for the time of day it should have been by now. I pressed the panic button on the key fob and heard a repeated car horn coming from around the opposite corner to where the tractor was. I followed the sound until I was around the corner of the building and looking at a big Dodge Ram dually truck with a camper in the bed. It was covered in all kinds of antennas and had some kind of radar system on the roof and a big moose bumper with a winch mounted on the front. It had the same Summer Island Research Facility lettering on the doors, and the words Mobile Research Unit written on the camper that sat in the bed. I remember thinking of my co-worker James, who wouldn't shut up about his overlanding rig, an old Toyota 4Runner with a collapsible rooftop tent. This truck was his wet dream. I silenced the alarm and unlocked the vehicle. Climbing into the driver's seat, I noticed the interior of the truck looked like a police car. There was a laptop mounted to the center console and all kinds of radio and electronic equipment. There was what appeared to be a CB radio overhead, which I turned on and quickly flipped through a few channels, but heard nothing. I put the key in the ignition, and while the big diesel engine wasn't happy about turning over in the cold, it did start. I sat there and let the truck warm up for a minute or two before setting off out of the parking area. Thankfully, although the tractor operator had only managed to clear the snow from half of the parking lot, it appeared as though the spiral road heading up to the surface had been plowed. Even still, it was slow going, as I didn't want to slide off the edge and plummet back into the pit. It took about 15 minutes, but I eventually reached the surface and stopped to survey the area. I put the truck in park and got out as if the windshield was somehow lying to me about what was outside. For as far as I could see, there was nothing but snow, not a single tree in sight, and although by this point it had to be at least 11 a.m., and it was completely clear the sun was nowhere to be found in the sky, the only proof of its existence was the dim light coming from over the horizon that was allowing me to see. Was I in the fucking Arctic? I let out a frustrated scream. What the hell was going on? I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Just hours ago I had been driving into downtown Toronto, and now somehow, inexplicably, I was on the edge of a research facility at the North fucking Pole. Off in the distance, on top of a hill, I could see lights in the direction that the road was heading. Maybe that's where everyone had gone, and maybe I could get some answers there. I jumped back in the truck and took off down the bumpy road as fast as I could go in the snowy conditions. My excitement was short-lived, however, as I arrived at the lights and realized they were landing lights for a small airstrip adjacent to the facility. I punched the steering wheel in frustration, causing the horn to honk. I had heard there were places in the Arctic that were only accessible by plane. If this was one of them and everyone had gone, then I truly was trapped up here. I shut the engine off and rested my head on the steering wheel. I'm a bit ashamed to admit it, but I had a complete mental breakdown. I couldn't understand anything that was going on, and now I was trapped in one of the most hostile places on Earth with no way home. My wallowing in self-pity was short-lived as I suddenly heard the sound of an approaching plane. I was overjoyed at the sound of this and immediately got out of the truck and began searching the skies for the incoming aircraft. Much like my self-pity, my feelings of joy were also short-lived as I spotted the plane coming low on the horizon. It was moving far too quickly to be a commercial jet or military cargo plane. No, there was only one thing that could be, and it was a fighter plane. I don't know a lot about the military, but they don't generally send fighter planes on rescue missions. At the same time, as realization struck me that this was not the government coming to the rescue, but rather a cover-up for whatever happened here. The plane fired a single missile at the edge of the massive pit. From my vantage point on the hill by the airstrip, I saw it collide with the rock wall and explode, sending rock and ice flying into the air. Then, what I had initially assumed was solid ground began to collapse into the pit, revealing itself to be a frozen body of water. Within seconds, the pit was flooded, and the impact from the wave pancaked the building and sent the communications tower collapsing to the bottom of the newly formed lake. The plane circled around again, heading for the airstrip. I dove back into the truck and hoped the white vehicle would blend in with the snow enough not to be seen by the pilot. It did, or at the very least the pilot didn't think it necessary to destroy a stationary vehicle. The plane fired off one more missile, cratering the runway, and then flew off again, disappearing over the horizon. I peeked up over the steering wheel as the last few pieces of rock came down, denting the hood of the truck. There was now no way for anyone to even land to come save me, but that was the least of my problems. Whatever was going on, the government clearly didn't want it getting out. If I was found, I would probably be shot on sight, even though I had nothing to do with it. My best bet was to get as far away from this place as possible and then try to seek help. My only problem was I still had no idea where I was, and all I had was this truck. If there were no roads out of here, I was screwed. There probably were snowmobiles in that facility somewhere, and I was kicking myself for not trying to find one before the facility got destroyed. Out of desperation, I opened the laptop mounted to the truck's console and found that, shockingly, it was not locked with a password. It seemed this laptop served only for navigation, but that was fine with me, as that's exactly what I needed. Even more shockingly, it did appear to have a connection to some kind of satellite system, and from that I was able to pull up a map and finally saw where I was. I was indeed in the Arctic Ocean on an island roughly 30 kilometers from Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories. My heart sank upon this realization. If I was on an island, then that airstrip really was the only way in or out. If the base hadn't been destroyed, I might have been able to survive up here till spring and found a boat or something once the ice melted, but it was gone now, and I definitely couldn't survive in this truck. Wait a minute, the ice, that was it! The water was frozen over between here and the mainland. If I could make it across, then I might be able to find help in Tuktoyaktuk. It was a long shot, but I had to try. I quickly took stock of the supplies I had in the truck, then checked out the camper sitting in the bed. There wasn't much, just a bunch of unhelpful science equipment, a few basic tools, some shovels, and some extra fuel cans which were thankfully full. I tossed all the science equipment out of the back into the snow and tried to make the inside of the camper look as civilian as I could. There were still beds and basic living amenities in there under all the research stuff, so I was hopeful I could make it look like just an ordinary truck camper. I then set to work peeling off the vinyl decals and truck numbers and anything else that could tie this vehicle to the facility. I also removed the patches with the facility's logo from all of the winter gear I had stolen. I needed the laptop and radar antennas for navigation, but told myself I would ditch those too once I was in sight of the settlement. I had heard the Dempster Highway had been extended to Tuktoyaktuk in 2017, so it was finally connected to the rest of Canada's roads. I could drive south into British Columbia if I made it there, but I had to be sure the truck couldn't be easily identified. I was impressed with how well the truck handled the deep snow as I pushed my way towards the shoreline. I knew any minute I could get stuck and that would be the end, but I kept going. It was nerve-wracking pulling out onto the ice, and I half expected to just immediately break through. I had seen enough ice road truckers on the History Channel to know to take my seatbelt off and drive slow, as to not create a pressure wave and crack the ice, so I crept along barely going above 40 kilometers an hour. This was a lot different than ice road truckers, though. Ice roads are actually maintained. It's not like they're just driving on untamed ice, like I was doing right now. It was bumpy, and I could hear the ice shifting and cracking under me as I crossed over the uneven sections. I was sure I was going to break through, but after about 2 hours of driving over the uneven ice, I saw the lights of Tuktoyaktuk in the distance. I stopped the truck and climbed onto the roof and ripped off the radar. Antenna then tore out the laptop mount from the cab and took off towards the town. I contemplated going to the locals for help, but figured that would only get me arrested. So I only stopped briefly for fuel, then took off down the long, lonely highway headed south. Bob, the guy who ran the gas station, was confused as he hadn't seen me come to town, but didn't ask too many questions. I only made one other stop in Inuvik for more fuel, but besides that I made it pretty much all the way to Whitehorse in the Yukon in one go. By this point I had been on the road for almost 24 hours straight and was exhausted and needed to rest. I decided to ditch the truck just outside Whitehorse and walk into town and find a room for the night posing as a tourist. Whitehorse had an airport and I could fly home from there the next day. I found an old logging road to hide the truck down. I contemplated setting it on fire, but I knew that would draw too much attention, so I just abandoned it in the trees, gathered my things and made the hour walk into Whitehorse. My night at the bed and breakfast there was the best sleep I had had in days, but sadly I was woken up early the next morning by my phone ringing. I'd forgotten I'd even had a phone since over the past few days it had been all but useless to me. "Hello?" I sat groggily into the phone. "Mr. Richards, this is Sergeant Powell with the Ontario Provincial Police. We have been trying to reach you for the past 2 days," said the voice on the other end of the phone. I immediately stiffened up. "What for?" I asked, assuming I had been reported missing. "About the accident you caused at the interchange of the 404 and the 401 on Monday. You rear-ended a dump truck and then swerved into the other lane where your car was rear-ended by a minivan, causing a 50-car pile-up. 11 people are dead and many more were injured. We could not locate you at the accident, so you have been presumed to have fled the scene on foot, which is a very serious offense," the officer continued. I had almost forgotten that I had been driving to work before all this started. Part of me thought that maybe I had lost some memory or something, but from what the cop was telling me it seemed like I had. No, that's crazy. There's no way I somehow teleported from the GTA to the Canadian Arctic. But then again, that did seem to be what had happened. "Well, I certainly hope you have the wrong person, officer," I said into the phone, trying to regain my composure. "You see, I'm in Whitehorse in the Yukon right now, visiting my aunt. Obviously I was not going to tell him why I was really up there. So if my car was involved in an accident, then it must have been stolen." "Is that so, Mr. Richards?" the cop said in a tone that I could tell meant he didn't believe me. "Well, if you have any proof of this, I'm going to need it as soon as you return." Upon landing at Toronto Pearson Airport, I was immediately taken into custody by the police. They did not believe my story of visiting my aunt in the Yukon at all, but had to let me go, as it was a pretty rock-solid alibi and all the receipts from my stay there and my flight home. I just claimed I lost my ticket for the flight there. After my release, I fully expected my house to get raided by the SWAT team or something, and I'd be hauled in for questioning about my involvement in whatever happened at the mysterious base. But nothing ever came of it. It seemed the police were really only interested in the car accident, and the higher levels of government had no idea I'd ever been up there. My insurance reluctantly paid for a new car, and everything went back to more or less normal. Somehow my job didn't even notice I was gone, so I still got paid for those days and went back to work as if nothing had happened. The only problem is, now I know that crazy stuff like this is possible. I don't know what the government was messing around with up there or what happened to all the people at that base, and I'm not sure I want to know. Either way, knowing that it's possible to just get plucked out of existence and reappear in another place entirely often leaves me sitting awake late at night, wondering if and when it might happen again. My name is Derek Shaw. I'm a survivalist, a man with a deep passion for nature and the wilderness. There's something about stripping life down to its basics. No tents, no gadgets, just me, the earth, and what I can pull from it. Over the years, I've spent more nights than I can count under the stars, in forests and mountains where most wouldn't dare tread alone, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened a few months ago. I've tried to push it out of my mind, tried to bury the memory in the same way I bury my fire pits, but the truth has a way of gnawing at you, like the wind rattling branches in the dead of night. I guess I'm finally ready to tell my story, the story of the most horrific camping encounter of my life. It was in Algonquin, a place I thought I knew well, a place I loved. Now, I'll never look at it the same again. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs with each breath, and the snow crunched under my boots as I trudged deeper into the forest. I'd been to Algonquin countless times, but never here, never this deep into its untouched wilderness. That was the thrill of it. The unknown, a stretch of land where no trails led and no campers had likely ever set foot. I carried just enough gear to get by. A flint, a small hatchet, a few essentials, but the rest, as always, would come from the land. That's how I did things. The trees grew denser the further I went, their branches sagging under the weight of snow. The landscape was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of the wind whipping through the evergreens. It was that stillness, that isolation, that made my heart race in a way nothing else could. This part of the forest was new to me, untouched and wild. I could feel the excitement building as I scanned the terrain for a suitable campsite. After another hour or so of hiking, I found it. A small clearing nestled between two towering spruces, their branches arching above to form a natural canopy. The ground was blanketed in snow, but beneath it, I could make out a rise in the land, an ideal spot for shelter. I dropped my pack and stretched, surveying the space. It was perfect, untouched by human hands. The idea of being the first to camp here, to explore these woods, sent a rush of energy through me. I could already picture the fire crackling in the center of the clearing, my shelter set up against the wind. This would be home, at least for the next few nights. Once the fire was going, the warmth of the flames began to melt the cold that had settled deep in my bones. The light flickered against the snowy backdrop, casting shadows that danced along the tree line. I took a deep breath, savoring the stillness for a moment before getting to work on the shelter. I gathered branches from the nearby trees, testing each one for strength before laying them out in a rough framework. A simple lean-to would do for the night. I layered the branches with smaller brush to insulate against the wind, which had started to pick up. My movements were automatic. This was routine for me by now, but as I worked, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a faint tug at the back of my mind, a strange sense that something was different. I paused for a moment, listening, but all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I shook it off and kept working, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the excitement of discovering new territory. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing minute. I stood up straight, wiping the sweat from my brow despite the cold, and glanced around the clearing. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing, just the quiet, snow-covered woods. And yet, the sensation crept up my spine like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck. It was irrational, I told myself. I was alone out here. I had to be. But there was something about the way the trees stood, the way the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the fire's reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I'd felt this way before, back in my early days of camping. That unsettling sense of being watched, always lurking just beneath the surface, gnawing at my nerves. I used to chalk it up to my imagination, the natural paranoia of being alone in the wilderness. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, that feeling never fully went away. After getting my camp set up, I decided to head out and forage. I had packed some emergency rations, but I always preferred living off the land. Mushrooms, berries, the occasional fish if I got lucky. It was part of the challenge, part of why I loved survivalist camping. As the fire flickered behind me, I grabbed my small foraging sack and made my way into the trees, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots. It wasn't long before I found signs of life, a set of tracks leading off deeper into the forest. At first I thought they were deer tracks. The pattern was familiar, but as I looked closer, something wasn't quite right. The prints were spaced strangely, almost like they'd been made by something walking on two legs rather than four. I crouched down, examining them more closely. Bipedal, but still shaped like hooves. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was silly, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Deer occasionally stand on their hind legs, especially when startled or trying to reach higher branches. It was rare, but not impossible. Still, something about these tracks felt off, unnatural. That's when the thought crept into my mind, the legend of the wendigo. I had heard the stories before, whispered around campfires late at night, a monstrous creature that roamed the forests, once human, but transformed by a hunger that could never be satisfied. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a story, a legend meant to spook children. Still, staring at those tracks, I couldn't help but feel the cold fingers of dread tightening around me. I decided to head back to camp, my mind still buzzing with thoughts of those strange tracks. On my way, I came across a fallen log, and there, clustered near its base, I found a patch of velvet foot mushrooms, small brown-capped fungi that thrive even in cold weather. I recognized them immediately. They were edible, and their resilience in these conditions always amazed me. Not much, but enough to complement the winter berries I'd gathered earlier. I carefully plucked a few of the mushrooms and made my way back to the camp, relieved to have found something familiar. Once there, I tossed a few more branches onto the fire, stoking the flames back to life. The crackle and warmth steadied me as I prepared a simple meal, grateful that the wilderness could still provide, even in the dead of winter. After eating, I settled into my shelter, letting the fire's warmth wrap around me as I lay back. The quiet of the forest was soothing, and the flicker of the flames lulled me into a sense of calm. Before long, I drifted off to sleep. But sometime deep into the night, something stirred me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was a rhythm to the noise, a deliberate crunching sound, something moving slowly just outside the camp. My heart raced as I strained to listen, my breath freezing in the cold air. It wasn't the wind. Something was creeping around the perimeter of my camp, each step slow, calculated. Whatever it was close. I gripped my hunting knife tightly, my fingers tense around the handle as I listened. Whatever it was, it sounded large, but its steps were small, deliberate. It wasn't a bear. I'd encountered bears in the wild before, and they made much more noise, especially when trudging through snow. No, this was something else, something quieter, more cautious. As I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds, a strange, foul odor drifted through the air. It was faint at first, but quickly grew stronger. It smelled of decay, like something rotting, foul and unnatural. My stomach turned, and I felt a chill creep over me that had nothing to do with the cold. The fire was dying, its light fading fast. I couldn't let it go out, not with something creeping around out there. Slowly, I reached over and grabbed a few pieces of wood, throwing them onto the embers. Sparks flew up, and the fire flickered back to life, casting long, dancing shadows around the trees. I sat up, listening intently, knife in hand, trying to locate the source of the smell and the sounds. But as the wind picked up, the noises began to fade. It was as if whatever had been circling the camp was walking away, its footsteps growing softer and softer until they disappeared completely into the night. For a long time I just sat there, my senses on high alert, waiting for the sound to return, but all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I finally let myself relax a little, convincing myself that whatever had been there was gone. The rest of the night passed without incident, and despite the unease gnawing at the back of my mind, I eventually drifted off again. The forest remained quiet, almost peaceful, but that lingering sense of something watching me never truly left. The next morning, with the sun shining through the trees and the fire reduced to glowing embers, the events of the previous night felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. The unsettling sounds, the strange smell, all of it seemed like the product of an overactive mind, stirred up by the isolation. I packed up what little I had used and set off to forage again, my focus shifting back to the task at hand. The forest was calm, and the cold air felt refreshing. But as I wandered further from camp, that creeping sense of unease returned. It wasn't anything immediate, no sounds, no movement, just a feeling gnawing at the edge of my awareness. Then I saw them, tracks in the snow. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to get a better look. The same hooved tracks from yesterday, the same strange pattern, as though whatever left them was walking on two legs, and they were close, too close. My camp wasn't more than 100 yards away, and these tracks, they circled it. I stood up, trying to shake off the rising dread. This didn't make sense. I'd been sure it was just a deer or some animal, but seeing those tracks again, so close to where I had slept, it was unsettling. My mind raced with possibilities, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving. There was a logical explanation. There had to be. Then, a sharp crack pierced the stillness of the forest, a sound so loud it seemed to echo off the trees. It wasn't the rustling of wind or the snap of a small twig. It was deliberate, heavy, like a large branch snapping under the weight of something. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the dense forest where the sound had come from. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A large, hulking figure, just at the edge of the trees, blending into the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out any details, but after a few agonizing moments of silence, the figure was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, the tension building in my chest as my mind fought to rationalize what I had seen, or thought I had seen. It had to be my imagination, the shadows playing tricks on me. I hadn't slept well, and the isolation was getting to me. That's all it was. I returned to camp, the strange feeling still clinging to me like a second skin. My mind kept drifting back to those tracks, the heavy snap in the distance, and that brief glimpse of something, if it had been anything at all. I shook it off and focused on gathering wood, deciding to collect more than I needed this time. If nothing else, I wanted the fire to burn strong through the night. As the day dragged on, that sense of being watched never left. It was subtle, like an itch I couldn't scratch, but always there, keeping me on edge. I tried to focus on my tasks, checking the perimeter, stoking the fire, but the unease gnawed at me. When the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I could feel the tension rising again. Night fell quickly, and soon it was time to settle in. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. My fire crackled in front of me, the soft glow offering some comfort against the darkness pressing in from all sides. I lay down, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me, trying to relax. The fire was strong, the camp was secure, everything would be fine. But then, deep into the night, I was jolted awake. A sound, no, a scream. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to cut through the silence like a blade. A screeching wail, distant but piercing. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in the natural world. My heart leapt into my throat, and goosebumps rippled up my arms and neck. I sat up, the knife back in my hand before I realized it. Every muscle in my body was tense, my ears straining to hear anything else. I had heard animals cry out in the night before, wolves, coyotes, even owls, but this was different. It was a raw, primal sound, full of something I couldn't place. Fear, anger, pain. I didn't know. But whatever had made it, I knew one thing for sure. I had never heard anything like it before. It was then that the realization hit me, hard and cold. I was no longer safe. The creature, whatever it was out there. And it was real. The tracks, the strange figure in the shadows, the eerie scream in the night. It had been watching me the whole time, waiting. I didn't know how long it had been lurking, but now, after that scream, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone out here. My mind raced, trying to piece together what to do next. My truck was about 5 miles away, parked near the edge of the trailhead where I had started. 5 miles through dense, dark forest, with that thing, whatever it was, out there, stalking me. The thought of escaping, of getting out of these woods, gnawed at me. It was the only thing that made sense, the only chance I had. But then, just as I was starting to gather my thoughts, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, distant, but unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted me to hear it coming. My pulse quickened, and my grip on the knife tightened. The sound was getting closer, each step crunching in the snow, growing louder with each second. I sat frozen, staring out into the darkness beyond the glow of the fire, but I couldn't see anything. The flames flickered weakly now, casting shadows that danced against the trees. It was close, closer than it had been last night. My breath hitched as I tried to steady myself, but the pounding in my chest drowned out every rational thought. I wasn't ready for this. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the camp and head for the truck, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot, and all I could do was listen as the footsteps grew nearer, the air thick with the smell of decay once again. I had to make a decision, stay and face whatever was out there, or make a break for it into the unknown darkness. Either way, the creature knew where I was. I had to run. There was no more time to think. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stay out there, circling my camp forever. I needed to get to my truck, back to the safety of civilization. The thought of fleeing surged through me like a bolt of adrenaline, but I knew I had to be smart about it, quiet. I didn't want to alert the creature until I had a head start. I moved quickly, my hands shaking as I tried to pack up my gear. My mind raced, trying to figure out the best route back. The forest was a maze in the dark, but the path wasn't entirely invisible. The snow, coupled with the bright moonlight, reflected enough that I could see through the trees, even if only barely. It was dangerous, but at this point, it didn't matter. I'd rather be lost out there than trapped with whatever was stalking me. I grabbed my bag and slung it over my shoulder, keeping my knife gripped tightly in my hand. The weight of the blade was reassuring, even though I wasn't sure it would do me any good. With one last glance at the dying fire, I stepped away from the camp, moving quickly but as quietly as I could. As soon as I was out of the small clearing, the sounds returned. The footsteps. They were behind me again, deliberate and slow, like the thing was pacing itself, just enough to keep up, but not enough to attack. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I couldn't hear the wind or the crackle of snow under my boots, just my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears like a drum. I walked faster, trying not to break into a full run. Running would make too much noise. I needed to stay calm, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to sprint, to flee into the darkness as fast as I could. I could feel it, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The footsteps were growing louder, keeping pace with me, as if it knew I was trying to escape. I clutched the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. I had no idea how far I'd gone or if I was even heading in the right direction. After what felt like an eternity of weaving through the dark forest, the trees finally began to thin out, and suddenly I stumbled onto the familiar main trail. Relief washed over me for a moment. This was the path that would take me back to my truck. I knew I had to head left, just a few miles to go, and I'd be safe. My legs burned from the cold and the tension, but I forced myself to keep moving, heart still racing in my chest. Then it happened. A scream, louder and more terrifying than the one I had heard earlier, shattered the silence. It wasn't just a sound. It was a visceral, blood-chilling wail that echoed through the trees, reverberating inside my skull. My entire body tensed, and without thinking, I spun around, knife in hand, my eyes scanning the forest behind me. That's when I saw it. Standing in the shadows just beyond the tree line, illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through the canopy, was the creature. Tall, emaciated, its skin clinging tightly to its bones, pale as death itself. Its eyes, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, locked onto me. The creature was skeletal, its body unnaturally thin, and its mouth stretched into a horrific grin, showing rows of jagged teeth. But what struck me most were the horns, massive twisted antlers protruding from its head, casting long shadows over its sunken, hollowed face. The wendigo. It was real. It wasn't just some legend, some old story to scare people around the campfire. It was here. It was hunting me. My blood ran cold, and for a moment I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its hunger, its malice radiating from it. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. This thing, this nightmare made flesh, wasn't going to let me leave the forest. I didn't wait for it to move. I bolted. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, down the trail, toward my truck, toward safety. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear it behind me, the soft, methodical footsteps and the echo of that terrible scream. The wendigo was coming. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my lungs burning with every breath, my legs pumping with a desperation I hadn't known I was capable of. Behind me, the wendigo was closing in, its footsteps growing louder, faster, more aggressive. I could hear its labored breathing, feel its presence bearing down on me. I was running as fast as I could, but it wasn't enough. It was gaining on me. My heart pounded harder than ever, fear coursing through my veins like fire. I could see the moonlight ahead, the trail narrowing as it bent through the trees. My truck was still too far, but I had no choice. I had to keep going. Every second counted. Then I heard it right behind me, too close. In a moment of pure survival instinct, I spun around, knife in hand, and lunged at the creature. I drove the blade deep into its chest, the point sinking into its pale, skeletal flesh. The wendigo let out a high-pitched wail of pain, its eyes glowing brighter as it screeched, but my attack barely slowed it down. With one powerful swipe of its long, emaciated arm, it knocked me clean off my feet. I flew through the air, my body tumbling uncontrollably. It felt like I was airborne forever, crashing through the snow and leaves before skidding to a painful stop. I must have flown at least 30 feet. The wind completely knocked out of me. Dazed, I struggled to move, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I tried to regain control. I looked up, my knife still embedded in the creature's chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It stood there, its grotesque form towering over the snow, blood oozing slowly from the wound as it locked its cold, glowing eyes on me. It began walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The way it moved was horrifying, its steps almost unnatural, its hunger palpable. I tried to push myself up, but before I could, the creature let out another deafening roar. The sound tore through the night, a high-pitched screech that pierced my ears and rattled my brain. It was unbearable. The sheer volume of it sent me to my knees. Hands clamped over my ears as I cried out in pain, trying to block it out. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and the world spun around me. I could feel the wendigo's rage, its hatred in that scream, and it was driving me to the brink of madness. I was helpless, vulnerable, and the wendigo was closing in. As I knelt there, ears ringing from the creature's horrific screech, a thought broke through the haze of pain. My flare gun. I had always packed it for emergencies, a last resort. This was beyond any emergency I'd ever imagined. The wendigo was closing in, its twisted form looming over me, ready to strike again. Desperately, I scrambled for my bag, fingers shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. The creature's footsteps were heavy, growing closer with each agonizing second. Finally, I grabbed hold of the flare gun, yanking it free. My heart raced as I cocked the hammer back, my vision still swimming as I raised the flare gun with trembling hands. The wendigo's glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel its malice, its hunger bearing down on me. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out with a blinding flash, filling the night with a brilliant red-orange glow. The world around me lit up in an instant. Every tree, every snow-covered branch illuminated in the harsh, fiery light. The flare struck the creature square in the chest, embedding itself next to my knife. For a split second, the wendigo stood frozen, its skeletal form outlined in the intense light. Then it screeched again, an ear-piercing, guttural wail that shook the very ground beneath me. The flare burned fiercely, sending plumes of smoke curling up from its chest as the creature thrashed in agony. Its movements became frantic, wild, as it staggered backward, clawing at the burning flare lodged in its flesh. I watched, breathless, as the wendigo turned and bolted into the forest, retreating into the dark wilderness from where it had come. The fiery glow of the flare flickered through the trees as the creature vanished into the night, my knife still embedded in its chest. Its howls echoed in the distance, growing fainter and fainter until, finally, there was nothing. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The creature had retreated into the forest, but I couldn't waste a second. Pain shot through my body with every step as I forced myself to run. My lungs burned, and my ribs throbbed from the impact of the wendigo's earlier strike, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The woods blurred around me as I sprinted toward my truck, each breath sharp and ragged in the freezing air. I burst out onto the trail, barely keeping my footing on the icy ground. My truck was just ahead, its shape almost surreal in the moonlight. I stumbled toward it, wrenching the door open and collapsing into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, and when I turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and groaned, refusing to catch. Come on, I muttered, panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I glanced frantically at the surrounding forest, half expecting the wendigo to burst from the trees at any second. Finally, with a rough cough, the engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into drive, but just as I pressed the gas, I heard something, the same sickening screech from before. I whipped my head around, and my blood ran cold. The wendigo was right outside my window. Before I could react, its bony hand smashed through the glass, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The freezing night air rushed in as its claws raked across my face. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a burning sting that cut deep into my skin. It was like its touch carried fire, searing my flesh. I screamed in agonizing pain. For a moment I thought it had me, its long fingers digging into my flesh. But I hit the gas, the tires spinning in the snow before catching. The truck lurched forward, and I felt the Wendigo's grip slip as it tumbled away from the window, screeching as I sped down the icy road. The cold air howled through the broken window, biting into my skin like needles, but I kept my foot down on the accelerator. My breath came out in desperate, ragged gasps, my face throbbing from the Wendigo's attack. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw it, a tall, dark silhouette, its glowing eyes locked onto me as it gave chase, its form unnatural and terrifying in the moonlight. It was fast, too fast, but as I pushed the truck harder, I could see the distance between us grow. Slowly, inch by inch, the Wendigo faded into the dark, its silhouette disappearing into the snowy wilderness. But I didn't slow down, not until I knew I was miles away. For weeks after that night, sleep had been elusive. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me under, the nightmares always dragged me back into the cold, haunted wilderness. My ribs, fractured from the creature's vicious strike, ached constantly. I hadn't even realized how badly I'd been hurt until I made it home. The adrenaline, the need to survive, it had all numbed the pain until I collapsed in my driveway. Now, my body bore the scars of that encounter. 3 long, jagged lines across my face, a permanent reminder of the Wendigo's claws. Every time I looked in the mirror, I was forced to relive that night, the night I came face to face with a legend. People had asked about the scars, and I always gave them the same answer: a bear attack. It was easier that way, easier than trying to explain what had really happened. Who would believe me? Tonight, though, the warmth of my home did little to soothe my nerves. Even surrounded by safety, I couldn't shake the lingering dread. It clung to me, a constant shadow, always waiting. Then it came. A sound in the dead of night, cutting through the silence with chilling clarity. A loud, screeching wail, unnatural, piercing. I shot up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. It was the same wail that had shattered the night in Algonquin. My heart raced as I sat there listening. The creature, whatever it was, it had found me. The Wendigo was still out there. Many years ago, a group of paranormal researchers and their local guide searched for a fellow scientist who, along with his students, disappeared with no trace. They came to Craven Moss Manor, a strange blight of a structure perched on the edge of an English cliff, like a vulture looking for a new corpse to feed on. I was one of the fools who thought they knew what was really happening at that accursed place. A dense fog had rolled in from the ocean, suffocating the cliffside where Craven Moss Manor stood. The unholy mist clung to the ground, refusing to lift even as the sun reached its highest point. The locals, long wary of the manor's sinister reputation, began to witness strange phenomena. Lights flickered in the fog, unnatural shadows moved where none should exist, and the most unsettling of all, the rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a colossal, invisible heart, echoed through the night air. Whispers of these occurrences eventually reached the university, where I and my other compatriots taught paranormal and supernatural quasi-science popular in those days. Alarmed by our friends' prolonged absence, the college board worried about their investment and sent a small search party to the manor, hoping to uncover the fate of the missing professor and his companions. The group, consisting of 3 fellow professors and a local guide, traveled to that malevolent house. I, the senior researcher at the time, set out with my friends toward the manor with a growing sense of unease. As we ascended the cliffside road, the fog seemed to thicken with each step, muting all sounds except the crunch of gravel beneath our boots and the ever-growing thump, thump, thump. The guide, a grizzled man hardened by years of living near the cliffside village, wiped a sheen of sweat from his weathered brow. His hand trembled, though he tried to hide it. "We should turn back," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper, as though the surrounding air would punish him for speaking too loudly. "This place, it's wrong. Always has been. There's something here that ain't meant for us." His words hung in the thick air, stirring something deep inside each of us, a primal fear that no amount of logic or science could dispel. We exchanged glances, the growing sense that perhaps we too were about to disappear without a trace gnawing at the edges of our minds. I hesitated, glancing up at the manor that loomed ahead, barely visible through the fog. Its twisted, decaying structure seemed to pulse in the mist, as though it had a life of its own, waiting, watching. The rhythmic thumping echoed louder now, almost as if the manor itself had a heartbeat. "We have to press on," I said, though my voice lacked the certainty I had hoped for. "We have a duty to find out what happened to our colleague, and to the others." But even as I spoke, I could feel the weight of the fog closing in, suffocating any semblance of rationality. The manor was alive, in its own horrible way, and it was waiting for us to step inside. Dr. Maria Hartman glanced at her colleague, Dr. Thomas Wallace. They shared a look, a silent debate of reason against terror. Finally, "Doctor," Hartman straightened her shoulders. "We're here for answers. Our friend and his students could still be inside." The guide's eyes widened, his pupils dilated with fear. He hesitated before nodding, though every bone in his body screamed to run. As we neared the manor, it loomed out of the fog, twisted and more decrepit than any of the photographs had shown. Cracked stone walls were covered in sickly moss, and windows of dark voids reflected nothingness. The front door stood slightly ajar, creaking like an open mouth ready to swallow us whole. Wallace's fingers twitched around his flashlight. "We need to find out what happened. We owe them that much." The guide swallowed hard, his voice barely a rasp. "If we go in there, we might not come back." We stepped inside, the door groaning shut behind us. As the heavy sound echoed through the decaying halls, the temperature dropped, and the stench of rot hit them like a wall. Cold, damp air weighed on their lungs. "Well, that isn't ominous or nothing," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. "I do not feel this is a jovial occasion, Dr. Aguil," Dr. Wallace complained, clearly upset by the atmosphere of the house. The rhythmic thumping grew louder. Each pulse reverberated through the walls, rattling the decayed fixtures. The house was alive, and its pulse matched that of the entity lurking within. The lower floors were eerily silent, filled only with the ruins of forgotten lives, dust-covered furniture, faded portraits, and books disintegrating into ash at the touch. It wasn't until we reached the second hallway that the nightmare truly began. Strange symbols, pulsating with a faint, sickly light, adorned the walls. The closer we got to the symbols, the louder the thumping became, vibrating the very air. Dr. Wallace ran his fingers over the grooves in one of the symbols. These aren't decorations, they're warnings. Or a ward. "Doctor," Hartman whispered, her eyes scanning the markings. "Something's trapped here. I dare say the only thing trapped here is bad cleaning." I poked at the symbols and my hand came away glowing. "See, it is just some sort of glowing moss causing these carvings to glow." We moved cautiously to the library, where a faint greenish glow seeped through the cracks of the door. Hartman pushed it open slowly. Inside, we found chaos. Shelves had collapsed, their contents reduced to heaps of dust. The table in the center was split clean in half, symbols etched into it now glowing with an unnatural light. The strange symbols on the walls glowed faintly, and the familiar rhythmic thumping resonated with an unnatural pulse, growing louder as if something were awakening beneath the floor. We scanned the room with mounting dread. The floorboards groaned underfoot, sagging as if alive. A creeping chill seemed to rise from the ground itself. "Do you feel that?" Hartman whispered, her breath shallow. "It's like the house is breathing." Wallace nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. "We need to leave. This place isn't just cursed, it's hungry." "You are just overwrought by the strangeness of this place," I said, rubbing my face free of sweat even amid the cool air. Wallace knelt and picked up what looked like a journal. Reading it, his brow furrowed more than I had ever seen it. His eyes widened and he looked back at us. "What is it, man? You look like you just read the love notes of Satan himself," I asked, fearful of the answer. "It is our friend's journal. We need to get out of here now." He made for the door as fast as I had ever seen him move. Suddenly the floor split open in jagged cracks, black tendrils of shadow spilling from the gaps like inky blood. The house began to twist around us, warping, bending its architecture into grotesque shapes. The once familiar walls transformed into slick, sinewy material, more akin to flesh than stone. Then came a deep, guttural laugh that reverberated through the very bones of the house. It was no longer just the rhythmic thumping. It was something else, something far worse. "The house! It's alive!" the guide screamed, backing toward the library door, only to find it sealed shut behind him. With no escape, the shadows from the cracks writhed like serpents, slithering up the walls, wrapping themselves around the rafters. They had a terrible sentience to them, like they were seeking something, someone. The guide froze, his voice trembling. "It's after us. It's been waiting for us." Before anyone could move, the tendrils shot forward and grabbed him by the ankles. His scream echoed off the warped walls as they dragged him toward the center of the room, where the floor seemed to open up like a yawning mouth. His body twisted unnaturally, bones breaking, skin stretching as the house consumed him, pulling him down into the black maw. We watched in horror, our legs paralyzed by fear. Hartman could barely speak. We have to go." Sickened by the sight of the man's death, I stood still, almost giving the creature, the house, time to make me into a snack. A tendril snaked out and stabbed at the place my foot had been a second earlier. "Holy shit! Run, you idiots, or we are next!" I yelled as I ran like my life depended on it, which in hindsight it did. "Upstairs. Maybe if we get above the mist, the thing will have no control." The air on the first floor grew thick with the stench of death. The house groaned again, its guttural laughter more distinct now, almost mocking us. We sprinted toward the hallway, but the walls were shifting, closing in. The once familiar path now spiraled and contorted, leading our desperate group deeper into the house's labyrinthine interior. Behind us, the sickening sound of bones cracking and flesh tearing reached us as the house devoured its prey. "Don't stop," Wallace gasped, pulling Hartman along. "It's trying to trap us." The warped walls cracked open and gave us an exit from this. All of us could be eaten buffet. I grabbed both of them and pushed them toward that last opening available. We bolted from the library, the green fog of the void chasing like a nipping dog after our retreating feet, devouring the floor, walls, and ceiling as we ran. The house shifted and contorted around our party, walls elongating and twisting like the intestines of some hellish beast. The air grew thick with the stench of blood, and the rhythmic thumping was now accompanied by guttural whispers, speaking in a language older than time itself. Finally, we reached the main hall. Just as we sighed with relief, having thought we had found a way out, the entrance was sealed shut. Stone lay where the doorway used to be, as though the house itself refused to let our dwindling group escape. The thumping was now unbearably loud, shaking the very foundation of the manor. Every corner we turned led them deeper into the nightmare. Doors disappeared, and windows melted into the walls. We're trapped," Hartman panted, tears streaking her face. "There's no way out." Wallace's eyes darted around frantically. "No, there has to be." "Up, up!" I screamed, pointing at the stairs we had just come upon. I bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, thankful I had kept my body as sharp as my mind. Maria Hartman was about 30, and she was a sometimes companion of mine. Presently, we were taking what she called a break, but I still had feelings for her, and I'll be damned if I was going to lose her to some nightmare house. I turned, grabbed her, and pushed her up the stairs. Wallace stayed close behind us, not wanting to be the one to get eaten next. The house groaned again, this time louder, as though savoring its victory. And then, from deep within its walls, came the sound of that laughter, a dark, resonant voice speaking words that none of us learned professors could understand. The ancient entity was alive, free, and it had no intention of letting us leave. As the shadows crept toward us, we heard a deep, resonant voice from the void, speaking in a tongue that burned our ears and attempted to shred our minds. The entity was whispering its dark will, its words clawing at our sanity. Hartman closed her eyes, the horror too great to bear. Wallace clenched his fists, his mind unraveling under the weight of the ancient, malevolent presence. As the shadows enveloped us, a final, chilling whisper from the house issued a promise that echoed through the void. "You are home." In a last-ditch effort to save us, I grabbed both and pulled them to a window. Hartman opened her eyes, looked out, and looked back at me just as a tendril snatched at Wallace. My friend of many years was hurled through the air and pulled into a hungry maw waiting for all of us. Maria screamed as he was eaten, and I grabbed her and we jumped. 50 feet, give or take a few inches, the water below would be very cold, even near freezing, but our chances were better in that jump than staying in the house. The house above trembled as if our escape broke it. The void the entity was fighting to escape swallowed the last remnants of light, and as the thumping grew deafening, it consumed itself and the house. I kept Maria in a tight squeeze and kept us plummeting feet first. We hit the water hard. I managed to get us to the surface, and then nothing but darkness as I passed out. Sometime later, I awoke in a cot on a fishing boat, Maria sitting there watching me intently. "I always knew you had a streak of crazy in you," she said, smiling, "but I never thought it would be what saved us." I am just as surprised as you that it worked. I jumped up, realizing we were still in danger. What of the house? What happened to it? The fisherman said there was a blackness that glowed, and then the house was gone. The cliff is now empty, Maria said, looking sad as she mourned our friend. He saved us even if it wasn't deliberate. His sacrifice gave us the time to jump and live another day. I hugged her close, as much to help her as to help me. What was that thing? She asked as she looked into my eyes. I contemplated the question, unsure how to answer. The last message our colleague sent us was that the observatory was being used to communicate across dimensions. I sat down as sudden weakness racked my body. They must have woken something up that was able to cross over into our world, even if partially. My vision blurred and the boat pitched. Matthew, what was that? Maria asked, fright lacing her voice. I guess a wave. I rubbed my eyes, trying to see clearly again. Slowly, my eyes cleared as a tentacle lashed out and pulled Maria into the depths. Maria! I screamed. I ran to the railing in time to see the creature wink out of existence with Maria in its jaws. In one last, almost defiant gesture, the monster had pulled open the gate between us and snatched Maria and the fisherman back to its hellish dimension. My mind was nearly destroyed by the loss of my love and the events of the day. I went to the cabin and piloted to shore, so I could tell the world of what we went through and what was coming. That beast opened the gate without human sacrifice or help. There is no reason to believe it will not do so again. So, if you see an article about a haunted house, do not go to investigate. It might just be a hoax, or it could be that creature hungry again for our flesh.